Do you feel lost, like you've wandered into a dense, shadowed wood, unsure of the path forward? Do distractions pull you from the still, small voice, leaving your soul restless and searching? Have you felt the weight of silence and wondered if God has left you alone? Here on the Distracted Christian Podcast, we walk that dark night together. Every step draws us closer to the one who's been waiting. His love is the light that guides, His grace, the compass that never fails. Man was made for joy and woe, and when this we rightly know, through this world we safely go. It's a quote from William Blake. It is a strange and terrible thing to wake up one morning and find that God has gone missing. Maybe just realized it. You felt it for a while, and now you feel like you can finally put your finger in it. It feels like He has left. You kneel where you have always knelt. You whisper the words you have always whispered, but the heavens have been boarded shut. You used to feel something, maybe warmth, a presence, a peace, but now prayer is like speaking into the wind. And Scripture feels like an ancient relic or a weighty object rather than the living voice of God. You wonder if maybe you've sinned, if you've failed, or if you've broken something irreparably, but no. What you are experiencing is something older than any sin that you could have committed. It is something ancient, something carved into the very nature of spiritual growth. It is the dark night of the soul. And tonight, we stand on the threshold of this terrifying yet purifying darkness. Guided by one of the greatest mystics of the Christian tradition, St. John of the Cross. We will descend with him into the depths of his chapters 8 and 9 of the Dark Night of the Soul, where he speaks of the purging fire that strips away our false gods and sentimental crutches and lesser loves. We will listen to stories from Job and David, who found themselves feeling abandoned by God and lost every comfort and left to wrestle with God in silence. Tonight we will learn to distinguish the dark night from spiritual laziness, to separate the furnace of God's love from the shadows of depression. We will discuss practical steps, biblical insights, and the terrifying yet liberating truth that in order to know God truly, sometimes it feels like He becomes a stranger to you. So lean in, take a deep breath, and tonight we enter the void, not to be lost into it, but to find in its depths the burning presence of God, who is never actually absent, even when He feels unseen. Welcome to the Distracted Christian Podcast. Let's begin. So, we've talked about the dark night a lot, and the last couple episodes we've been talking about various sins and imperfections and immaturities in the Christian life that we gradually have to work through and grow up in as God leads us towards Himself. And now we return to this concept of the dark night that St. John writes about. And I just want to review the two stages of the dark night as we set the stage for really trying to understand it, especially in the context of depression, because I feel like this is something necessary to really grasp and comprehend before we go too much further. So St. John describes two kinds of dark nights, of times of purification, or in our evangelical context, we might say sanctification. And these correspond to two parts of the human nature. One, the night of sense. This is the more common stage, where a person begins to detach from worldly pleasures and sensory experiences. It is difficult because the soul, once accustomed to spiritual sweetness and joy, suddenly finds itself in dryness, unable to feel God's presence in the way it used to. And then secondly, there's the dark night of the spirit. This is a far more intense and typically, as St. John puts it, reserved for those who have already progressed through a deep spiritual journey. It is a deeper, sometimes more painful stripping away, preparing the soul for true union for God, as he puts it. Since most people only go through the first stage, as St. John says, he focuses on that first. And he describes this purification as it happens. He says this: God turns all their light of theirs into darkness and shuts against them the door and the source of sweet spiritual water which they were tasting in God, whensoever and for as long as they desired. This means that those who once felt joy in prayer, reading scripture, or meditating on God may suddenly find those very things dry, empty, and even bitter. They feel abandoned, confused, and lost. However, St. John assures us that this is not a sign of failure. On the contrary, it means that God is preparing the soul to move beyond spiritual baby food, if you would, into something deeper. Imagine a child learning to walk. At first, a parent holds them up, gently guiding their every step. But eventually, the parent must let go so that the child can walk. The child may feel abandoned and scared and unsteady, but in reality, the parent is helping them grow. Similarly, God removes the beginner's sense of comfort so that they can learn to rely on faith rather than feelings. For those who are spiritually inclined, this dark night often comes sooner. Those who are already trying to avoid worldly distractions and focus on God tend to enter this phase more quickly. Ordinarily, no great time passes for their beginnings, St. John says, before they begin to enter this night of sense. And the great majority of them do it, in fact, and they will generally be seen to fall into these aridities. In other words, if you are pursuing God seriously, this dry season is almost inevitable. So, digging into chapter 9 of the Dark Night of Sense, what does he say there? Not all spiritual dryness is, in fact, the dark night. Sometimes dryness comes from sins, laziness, or even physical illness. So how can we tell if someone is struggling, if their spiritual struggle is truly this God-given sanctification process? And St. John gives us 3 clear signs. First, the soul finds no pleasure in anything, whether spiritual or worldly. He says this: the first is whether, when a soul finds no pleasure or consolation in the things of God, it also fails to find in anything he created. If a person's dryness is due to sin, they will usually still find enjoyment in worldly distractions, entertainment, food, relationships, or other pleasures. But when God leads the soul into the dark night, he strips it of all superficial comfort. Nothing satisfies anymore, not even the old joys of the faith. However, this could be due to mental or physical struggles like depression. And that's why we also need this second sign. 2, the soul still longs for God even though it feels abandoned. St. John says, the memory is ordinarily centered upon God, with painful care and solicitude, thinking that it is not serving God, but is backsliding because it finds itself without sweetness in the things of God. Even though the person does not feel God, they still desire, their mind, their memory is centered on God. This is different from spiritual laziness, where a person stops caring about prayer or faith altogether. This is different from depression, where the person loses all desire to grow. No, yes, they feel abandoned and empty, but still their soul longs for God. A soul in the dark night is still worried about pleasing God, still struggling to seek Him, even when there is no comfort in doing so. The third sign is the soul cannot meditate or pray as it used to. The soul can no longer meditate or reflect in the imaginative sphere of sense as it once wont. However, much it may of itself endeavor to do so. before the person could think about God easily, finding inspiration and comfort in spiritual exercises. But now, all effort feels empty. The imagination fails, and they cannot connect with God in the usual way. This can be frustrating, but St. John explains that this is actually a sign of growth. God is drawing the soul into a deeper form of prayer, one that is not based on pictures that we conjure up or on thoughts or emotions, but on silent trust. He compares his experience to the Israelites in the desert. When God gave them heavenly manna, they still longed for the onions and meats of Egypt. They did not yet understand the gift that God was giving to them. Similarly, the soul in the dark night may mourn for the loss of the former experiences, not realizing that God is leading it to something much, much greater. So, what should a person do in the dark night? St. John advises that a person in this state should resist the urge to force their old methods of prayer. Instead, they should be still. If those souls, St. John says, to whom this comes to pass knew how to be quiet at this time, they would delicately experience this inward refreshment. Also, they should trust God. Even when he feels distant, he is working in the soul more deeply than before. And third, they should let go of control. Spiritual growth does not come from effort alone. It's not a work sanctification, but from surrender to God's work. He warns that if a person tries to hold onto their old ways of praying and seeking God too closely, they may actually interfere with his work in them. This is why St. John describes this time as the dark night, not because it is bad, but because it requires faith rather than sight. We can't see, it's dark. The soul is no longer relying on feelings or understanding. Instead, it must learn to trust God even in the darkness. Now, the dark night of the soul, as articulated by St. John of the Cross, sounds a lot like clinical depression. And they share strikingly similar symptoms: despair, emotional numbness, loss of joy, exhaustion, and a sense of abandonment. However, while these experiences overlap in form, they differ fundamentally in nature, cause, and resolution. Understanding these differences is crucial, as mistaking one for the other can lead to spiritual misdiagnosis or, conversely, neglecting psychological treatment when it is needed. So let's understand depression from a psychological perspective. According to modern psychology, depression is a medical condition with identifiable symptoms, such as persistent sadness or emotional numbness, loss of interest in activities once enjoyed, fatigue and lack of energy, difficulty concentrating and memory issues, feelings of guilt or worthlessness, changes in sleep and appetite, suicidal thoughts, or just self-destructive behavior. Depression is caused by a combination of a lot of different things: biological, sociological, psychological, and environmental factors. Brain chemistry, hormone imbalances, traumatic experiences, and chronic stress can all contribute to the development of depression. Treatment typically involves therapy, sometimes medication, or a combination of both. And it helps to get you back to a balance and improve thought patterns in your mind. Now, the dark night as a spiritual experience of transformation. The dark night, as described by St. John of the Cross, is not an illness, but a period of deep spiritual purification. It is a part of the soul's journey towards greater freedom and union with God. So, a person in the dark night may experience a loss of spiritual consolation, a sense of abandonment by God, inability to pray or meditate as before, despondency and sorrow, but without despair, purging from attachments of worldly or even spiritual pleasures, and a shift from a felt faith to a pure, naked faith. St. John explains that God removes the spiritual sweetness that once nourished a soul, much like a child being weaned from breast milk. These experiences are not a punishment nor a sign of regression. Rather, it is a necessary detachment from superficial spiritual consolations to prepare the soul for a deeper relationship with God, one that is based on love and faith, not on feelings. So, the similarities are obvious, but both the dark night and depression can manifest with sadness, numbness, lack of motivation, a feeling of emptiness, guilt, and self-examination, an experience of isolation, and a sense of meaninglessness. And because of these shared symptoms, it's easy to mistake one for the other. Regina Balmer and Michael Platting, in their study of the dark night and depression, highlighted even those experiencing a dark night may believe they are clinically depressed, and vice versa. So there have been actual clinical studies on this, discussing what's going on with the dark night and clinical depression. But there are differences. And how do we distinguish the two? Well, first, there's the root cause. The root cause of the dark night of the soul is spiritual purification, God removing attachments. But for depression, again, it's psychological, biological, or environmental factors. Now, it also affects how we view God. So, in the dark night, we feel abandoned, but we still long for God. In depression, you feel abandoned, but you don't have any spiritual longing. Even that spiritual longing is gone. What about faith? Well, in the dark night itself leads to a deeper trust despite the dryness. Depression leads to doubt, loss of faith, or indifference. Self-perception in the dark night. In the dark night, we see ourselves as weak, but still belonging to God, even though we feel abandoned. We know we belong to Him, but we feel abandoned by Him. In depression, you often get feelings of just fundamentally worthless or broken. What about suicidal thoughts and the desire for death? In the dark night, it's a desire to be united with God, but not to despair unto death. However, in depression, often we get the suicidal thoughts, a desire for nothingness, or an escape from the pain. Physical symptoms in the dark night is rare. Everyday life remains stable. But in depression, you lose sleep, appetite, energy, and libido. They're all affected. And what about the resolution? In the dark night, it's surrender, patience, and spiritual growth. In depression, usually it's therapy, medication, and usually major life changes. One of the clearest distinctions that lies behind the dark night is the underlying desire behind the experience. As St. John of the Cross suggests that the dark night can even heal certain types of depression, as it forces the individuals to let go of unhealthy attachments, not only in the worldly things, but also to the rigid, limiting images of God. However, clinical depression requires medical and outside intervention, and failing to recognize it can lead to severe consequences. Karl Rahner, addressing the modern spiritual crisis, acknowledges that the experience of darkness and emptiness is inevitable in both faith and psychological suffering. However, he warns this: when mysticism talks about the dark night of senses and the dark night of spirit, this must not be confused with diverse psychologically or sociologically induced depressions contemporary man is suffering from. So, pastors, spiritual directors, and mental health professionals must exercise discernment. While spiritual direction may be appropriate for the dark night, depression may require intervention by medical and psychological personnel. Balmer and Platting emphasize that just because someone is pious does not mean their suffering is a spiritual crisis, rather than a psychological disorder. Now, it is possible to experience both a dark night and clinical depression simultaneously. Henry Nouwen and St. John of the Cross both acknowledge that the dark night can sometimes heal depressions, but other times, again, medical help is required. A practical way to distinguish the two is functionally. Someone in the dark night can usually function in daily life. Their work, relationships, and physical health remain intact. Someone with severe depression struggles with basic life tasks, getting out of bed, eating, maintaining relationships. So, if you suspect that you're in a dark night, what do? We surrender to the process. This is God's work, not your own. Remain faithful in prayer, even if it feels dry. Find support in a spiritual director or a mentor who understands the spiritual life. Resist a temptation to force older prayer methods and find a way to pray, to continue to pray, but to build that relationship with God. Now, if you suspect that you're suffering from depression, of course, seek professional help, therapy especially, and look at your lifestyle and modify that. And if necessary, sometimes medication can be life-saving. Don't spiritualize everything. While faith helps you, God wants us to take care of our body. And if you're getting 3 hours of sleep and wondering why you're so depressed, well, God might be just telling you to go get a nap and to fix your lifestyle. Don't spiritualize it. Your faith exercised maybe to go get a nap, eat healthy, exercise, go to therapy, and get medication if necessary. Another key part is to stay connected to loved ones, even when isolation feels tempting. And take care of your body. Nutrition, exercise, and sleep, these are all critical for good mental health. The dark night is a process of spiritual transformation, and depression is an illness that requires treatment. Confusing one for the other can be dangerous, and either by neglecting necessary medical care or reducing everything to a spiritual crisis. However, both experiences can be brought by God and can be used by God to help us grow into Him and help us to realize how great He is. When both experiences are navigated wisely, they can lead to profound growth, humility, and inner freedom. I'm not saying that God brings one and not the other, or vice versa. I'm just saying sometimes one leans more spiritual and one leans more physical. And we need to have discernment as to which one is which. So where do we find this dark night of sense in the scriptures? It resembles biblical patterns, like we find about Israel's wilderness experience and the trials of figures like Job, David, and even Christ himself. So we look at Deuteronomy chapter 8, where Moses says, "And you shall remember the whole way that the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness, that He might humble you, testing you to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep His commandments or not. And He humbled you and let you hunger and fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that He might make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord." Like Israel, the dark night of the soul initially experiences God's presence through tangible gifts, spiritual sweetness, emotional highs in prayer, and a sense of nearness to God. However, just as God withdrew the comforts of Egypt and tested Israel in the desert, He also removed spiritual constellations to teach us that we must rely on Him alone. We can look at the example of Job. Behold, I go forward, but he is not there, and backward, but I do not perceive him. On the left hand, when he is working, I do not behold him. He turns to the right hand, but I do not see him. But he knows the way that I must take, and when he has tried me, I shall come out as gold. That's Job 23, 8 through 10. Like Job, the dark night of the soul, a person there experiences profound spiritual desolation. He does not feel God's presence, yet he clings to faith. He may make errors like Job, but yet he still clings to faith. And this is exactly what happens to him, is what St. John is describing in the dark night. This stage, it finds no pleasure in spiritual or worldly things. And like Job, we may feel desolate. But yet, Job can declare that even in this darkness, it is not an abandonment, but refinement. The psalmist, we could look at Psalm 73, verses 25 through 26. Whom have I in heaven but you? And there is nothing on earth that I desire besides you. My flesh and my heart may fail, but God is my strength of my heart and my portion forever. This is the point, again, where the psalmist is focused on God, where the psalmist desires nothing but God alone. Another sign of the spiritual dryness is Psalm 42. As the deer pants for the streams of water, so my soul pants for you, O God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When shall I come and appear before God? If you're lukewarm, a person who is lukewarm cares nothing about God. They feel dry and simply walk away from prayer. But the one in the dark night still longs for God, even if they feel nothing in the moment. So, if you're experiencing spiritual dryness, uncertainty, or emotional distress, it is important that you discern what is happening before you take action. The dark night of the soul is not the same as spiritual laziness or depression, and each requires a different response. And so today I want to focus on that. And the steps below will help you distinguish between them, between spiritual darkness, the dark night of the soul, and depression, and help you respond accordingly. So, first of all, what category are you in? Take time to assess your experience by reflecting. In the dark night of the soul, you feel spiritually dry, but you still long for God. Prayer feels empty, but you remain faithful. You cannot pray or meditate as before, but you sense God is leading you deeper into a silent faith, perhaps. You do not find satisfaction in worldly things either, only a longing for God. You feel as if God has hidden himself, yet faith persists. What should you do? Well, accept it as part of your spiritual growth. Do not force old prayer habits. Find a way to relate to God. Keep working on it. Keep studying on it. Don't just disregard prayer. Sometimes we must embrace silence and surrender. Speak spiritual guidance and trust that God is working in you, even if you can't feel it. What about depression? You feel persistently numb, hopeless, or despairing. You feel guilty or worthless, as if you have no purpose. You experience physical symptoms, changes in sleep, appetite, energy, or ability to function. You have difficulty maintaining relationships, work, or daily responsibilities. You have suicidal thoughts or feel like life is not worth living. Your response is to seek professional help immediately. Depression is not just a spiritual issue. It can come and it has a lot to do with our spiritual life. But a lot of times depression comes from our physical side. And really, I'll put it this way, taking care of your physical side is a very spiritual act. And sometimes it's the most spiritual thing you can do is to take care of your physical body. So go and get help. Talk to someone, a therapist, a doctor, or even a trusted friend to get you help. Prioritize your physical health, exercise, nutrition, proper sleep. Those three right there, if you can get those on track, just Google it. Exercise, nutrition, and proper sleep will solve a lot of problems. Stay connected, avoid isolation, even if you don't feel like being around people, and seek pastoral guidance. If you got a good pastor, they want to hear from you. And faith is a source of strength, and we want to help you. So don't overcomplicate your response. Simply choose one of these steps and choose it today. If you're in one of these circumstances, take a step forward. In the dark night, here's something you can do. Sit for 5 minutes in silence, offering God your dryness as an act of faith. If you're in depression, reach out to just one person today, a friend, pastor, or counselor, and let them know how you're feeling. Each step, no matter how small, moves you closer to healing and growth. Trust that God is with you in this season, even if you cannot feel Him. As we close this episode of the Distracted Christian Podcast, let us leave the silence of this night with a deeper understanding of its mystery. Whatever night you walk through, remember, no darkness is final. Even Christ, who cried out in forsakenness, rose in the brilliance of the morning and shattered death itself, and He is the first fruits of many brethren. Your night will pass, the dawn will come, and when it does, you will find that even in the deepest void, you were not alone. So go on, weary traveler, walk in faith, not in sight. You can rest in the unknown because you know that God is with you. Let God do His work, for beyond it waits a love that is more real than anything you have ever known. If you like this podcast, if it helps you today, I encourage you to share, subscribe, rate, review, all those good things that we're supposed to do as good Christians. And share this podcast and give it to somebody else who might need it. I appreciate you listening today. It's been an honor to be able to talk to you. Thank you for making it all the way to the end. And until next time, be patient, be watchful, and do not fear the night. For even here, even now, God is nearer than you can imagine. Thank you for spending time with me today. And a special thanks to Anton Koryakov for our introduction and theme music. His artistry sets a tone for these conversations, and I'm grateful for it. This has been the Distracted Christian Podcast. Good night, and God keep you in His light.